one in a series of AASHTO Rail Resource Center webinars that we're looking at putting forward in this next fiscal year. You may know that AASHTO created the Rail Resource Center several years ago as an opportunity for states to have peer exchange opportunities to provide technical assistance, to produce publications that the Resource Center members feel are important, such as we're updating the Freight Rail Bottom Line Report. We're developing state-supported corridor profiles. We're creating a new website this year. We did we're looking to do a freight rail public-private partnership workshop at our upcoming SCORT meeting. You may remember several of you participated last year in our transit-oriented development workshop that we did in Chicago. Also, with the Resource Center, you are allowed to use a portion of your dues to reimburse for travel for these meetings. And as I said, we are starting a series of webinars, this being the first one, on last mile terminal area planning. And our Resource Center members have been surveyed to look at other potential future webinars. So with that, I will turn it back over to our states and our host, and we can move forward from there. I did want to let you know that we will, as Matt mentioned earlier, we're recording the webinar. We'll be putting the slides online, and then HNTB will be helping to put together a summary that we will have of the webinar as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Thanks, Shane. This is Randy Wade again with HNTB. I'll give a brief introduction. A lot of the material I'm going to present will be highlighted in really concrete examples by our speakers that will be introduced shortly. I think everyone has heard the word last mile. You may not be aware of the fact that it's a term that has come up in terms of other system planning activities. In telecommunications in the 60s and 70s, the big challenge was, well, how do we serve the individual homes? There's a very high cost to get to individual homes compared to the trunk line cost of providing the service itself in terms of cable television and the cable infrastructure we're all used to using. In terms of freight logistics, when you look at operations, in terms of express freight by UPS, FedEx, UPS, DHL, as well as a whole variety of other freight operators, including rail intermodal, up to 28% of the cost of the goods movement is focused on getting from the distribution center to the home or commercial destination. So that's an issue that is very evident on the freight side, but it certainly is a piece of the concern we have on the passenger side. Next slide. In terms of the challenges that we face in the last mile terminal area, and I say terminal area, it's the area around the station. It's a term of art. People use the term in terms of the freight terminal area around the historic station areas. Infrastructure costs are typically the very highest in a passenger rail project. This is a generalization that I'm making now. There are exceptions, but when you look at the existing freight congestion that typically is seen in the terminal area, and you've got passenger trains that are being introduced to compete for that limited shared use capacity, as well as existing transit and commuter rail operations that are in the corridors and utilizing the corridors or using the actual track infrastructure on a shared use basis. Congestion is a big issue, and infrastructure costs escalate because of all that activity. Typically, the existing corridors provide limited space for adding additional track, although it can be done. You see numerous grade crossings in urban areas that either, if they haven't been addressed, need to be addressed for a successful and safe passenger rail operation. And as soon as you get involved in providing elevated track structure, even on limited flyovers and other kinds of, I guess what I call bridge structures, you've got the most costly kind of infrastructure you'll ever see on a passenger rail improvement program. In terms of terminal area operations, of course, the Holy Grail always has been on the part of the states let's succeed in having at least a 79 to 80 mile an hour conventional Amtrak operation or 110 mile an hour passenger operations on shared use corridors. There are real challenges in achieving either of those goals in the terminal areas. You've got freight and transit congestion that I just mentioned. You've got metric limitations where there are lots of curves that are historically there and can't be straightened because of the urban development area. You've got a great deal of difficulty in terms of adding infrastructure where the existing corridor capacity has been utilized already by track structure. What states have found and the engineering community has found is that the low-hanging fruit approach is the one which works. You're looking at low-cost infrastructure where you're trying to save minutes in terms of travel time at lower cost rather than trying to increase speeds. And that's the typical approach, and I'm sure some of our speakers will be speaking to that. I know that Eugene and Portland presentations from Oregon DOT will highlight some of those low-hanging fruit examples. Station development itself, aside from infrastructure, is also challenging. You've got to find space and turning geometrics for taxis and bus operations, not to mention, how do we bring urban and commuter rail transit into the intercity passenger terminal for seamless cross-platform transfers. One option to increasing capacity at a downtown station or suburban and airport stations, you can add additional ridership using that option. In my prior life, I remember talking to the Metro, the Chicago Metro Commuter Rail AVP for strategic planning, and his comment was, in terms of his work, he spent as much time on developing parking as he did in terms of actually providing additional infrastructure for rail operations. And parking becomes, once again, a very critical part of any station development exercise, and land acquisition around stations we found is always a big issue when you need to add parking. Mixed-use development is both a challenge and an opportunity. You can gain income that can help support the station with mixed-use development, but you've got to provide an infrastructure for it. It also provides an opportunity to provide additional tax base to, over time, support the development of the station. But it makes for a more complicated, effort in terms of station development. And then finally, historic stations attract users. They've got their own challenges, though. Landmark status is always a challenge. No one wants anyone to affect in any kind of major way an existing station. Many of these stations have got great halls. They're beautiful, but in some ways, from the perspective of space utilization and heating and cooling, they're not the most efficient approach. Adding escalators and other ADA access options is always a challenge in an existing station because of the layout of stairways and other street access opportunities. So there are a variety of challenges actually at the station. Finally, in terms of getting to the station, excessive access times can compromise overall trip times and also put a crimp on overall ridership. If you're inner city rail, riders live and can walk within a quarter mile of the station itself, you've met the gold standard in terms of station access. That isn't always the case, but that is something always that we try and achieve, and transit-friendly development is a part of that effort. Dedicated feeder bus offers another way to get people into a given station or stations along the way. Wayfinding is important, not just in terms of highway and street access, but in the station itself. How do I get onto the proper street and make the next move to my ultimate destination? I note that at the Milwaukee Amtrak station, there's a big and very large display screen with the current freeway congestion and the freeway layout outside, so people understand, what's the best way to move from the station to destinations. And then you've got bike sharing and parking opportunities, technology opportunities. I know we'll hear about that from Paul Worley. And then we've talked about transit-friendly development in terms of what it can offer to developing a station and providing better access by virtue of having your riders live closer to the station. So these are all some of the things we'll be talking about. Our speakers will again provide some concrete examples of many of these. So let's turn to our first speaker. Elliot Ramos is up next. He's going to be talking about the Chicago terminal area, a classic last mile area. Elliot's with the Illinois Department of Transportation and handles a lot of the rail engineering activities for Illinois DOT. Take it away, Elliot.
Thank you, Randy. As Randy mentioned, my name is Elliot Ramos. I'm a passenger rail engineer for the Illinois Department of Transportation. Aaron, if we could move to the next slide. We have a robust passenger rail service here in Illinois and in Chicago, and I thought it would be appropriate to illustrate our existing conditions here in the state and in Chicago specifically. Today, Chicago is the hub of the Midwest, and we serve, Amtrak serves Chicago from the north, south, east, and west. Today, there are 56 Amtrak trains operating daily through Chicago, and of those, there are 30 Illinois state-supported intercity passenger trains. On this map on the right of the slide, the blue line, the blue solid line, shows the routes for the Amtrak trains through the state. And then the red dashed line, which is superimposed over it, shows our state-supported routes. We have a Chicago-St. Louis Lincoln service route, which features 4 round trips per day, which will feature high-speed rail between Joliet and Alton. We have the Chicago-Carbondale route, the Illini and Saluki service, which features 2 round trips per day. The Chicago-Quincy service, which is 2 round trips per day, and the Chicago-Milwaukee-Hiawatha service, which is 7 round trips daily and 6 on Sunday. This service we co-support with Wisconsin DOT. And then we have another service in development to provide 2 round trips to the Quad Cities from Chicago, and that's shown on the map in purple. Amtrak currently serves nearly 5 million riders at Illinois stations, and the Illinois services serve approximately 2 million riders per year. As an example, 283,000 Amtrak riders used the Chicago Union Station in just April of this year. On this slide, in addition to Amtrak, Chicago does have significant commuter services. The map on the left here doesn't really do justice for the complexities of all the services going into and out of the Chicago terminal area. But you can see a Union Station there. In yellow on this map, it features the commuter lines, the Metra and South Shore line. There are 6 Metra routes that use Union Station every day. 3 are on the south side of Union Station, and another 3 are on the north side. And then the other stations that are used for Metra services, Ogilvie Station has 3 services. LaSalle Street Station has 1 service, and the Millennium Park Station has 2 services, the Metra Electric service and the South Shore line. The blue line and the red dashed line correspond to the long-distance trains in blue, and the red dashed state-supported lines. It's kind of difficult to see, but there's a lot of lines that are superimposed on each other, and that just highlights that these are shared use corridors. In addition to all the commuter services, we do have equipment movements that are used and needed within the Chicago terminal area, including the A2 interlocking, which is on the north side of Union Station. It's shown here in a yellow circle. The Metro BNSF 14th Street Yard on the south side of Union Station. The Amtrak 18th Street Yard, also on the south side of Union Station. And the 21st Street Bridge, which carries the tracks over the Chicago River. As you can see, it's a very complicated and tangled web of tracks and corridors and routes into and out of Union Station. And as we move forward with various projects, we need to accommodate future growth of these services and to optimize these existing movements. Next slide, please. In fall of 2014, we assembled what was called the Chicago Terminal Working Group, which was to get technical staff from various working and ongoing study groups in one room to discuss the various issues in and around Union Station. The groups that were assembled featured the Chicago to Joliet Tier 2 EIS, which was evaluating a high-speed rail route between Chicago and Union Station. This is part of the overall Chicago-St. Louis corridor. Also, technical staff from the Chicago to Detroit Pontiac Tier 1 EIS, which was evaluating high-speed rail service between Chicago Union Station and Detroit. The Chicago Union Station Master Plan, which was developed to examine transportation improvements to Chicago Union Station and various developments around the station. The St. Charles Airline Study, which was a study performed by IDOT to evaluate an improved connection from Chicago Union Station to route south, the city of New Orleans long-distance train, and the Illini and Saluki routes, and basically looking at that to see what can be done to eliminate a backwards Amtrak move into and out of Union Station, which adds 19 minutes of travel time. And then finally, the technical staff from the CREATE program. And I'll get into more discussion of CREATE on some of my later slides. But the CREATE program is to improve transportation and specifically rail flow through Chicago. This working group had a lot of good discussion, and there was a lot of brain power in that room. We were able to collaborate to optimize improvements and develop some high-level feasibility alternatives for connections into and out of Union Station. But what really came out of that Chicago Terminal Working Group was that it identified a significant need for additional modeling and further study of the Chicago terminal area. Next slide, please. The Illinois Department of Transportation, along with the Chicago Department of Transportation and Metro, applied for a grant from the Federal Railroad Administration and was selected in 2015 for the Chicago Terminal Planning Study. This study was set to analyze the Chicago terminal area's complexity and the interdependency of the passenger and freight services that I was referring to on the previous slides. The overall goal of this study is to seek an enhanced and improved rail service for existing and future intercity passenger trains, long-distance Amtrak trains, and planned expansion of Metro commuter trains. It also include a dedicated passenger corridor to accommodate 2 continuous main tracks from Chicago to Detroit and other destinations east. As you can imagine, this planning study is pretty extensive and will require pretty significant operations modeling, alternatives analysis, and significant stakeholder outreach, working with all the Class 1s, Amtrak, Metra, various states that we're working with that those corridors go through, including Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin. So it's going to be a significant effort that we're taking forth to try to untangle and optimize the Chicago terminal area. The main outcome of the study will be to produce an enhanced Chicago-Detroit-Pontiac service development plan, and that will include that Chicago terminal area in more detail and position the prescribed improvements for future federal funds. Just as a note, the current status of the study, we're in the contracting and administrative phase, and we anticipate kickoff this fall. I mentioned CREATE several times, so next slide. I'll discuss briefly what it is at a high level and then highlight one of the key projects that helps in the Chicago terminal area. The CREATE program, CREATE stands for Chicago Region Environmental and Transportation Efficiency Program. It's a $3.8 billion public-private partnership designed to improve transportation flow through Chicago, focusing on freight train traffic, separation of freight and commuter trains at 6 key junctions, elimination of 25 road and rail grade crossings or grade separations. It's a cooperative project involving partnership from the U.S. Department of Transportation, both the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Railroad Administration, Illinois Department of Transportation, Chicago Department of Transportation, and 6 major North American freight carriers in the Chicago area, as well as Amtrak and Metra. For perspective, the the CREATE program was created in 2003. So there's been a lot of time developed looking at various ways to improve the flow of rail traffic through Chicago. And if you think about it, it's the first program in which so many of the competing railroads have come together to improve efficiency of an urban rail network. In the CREATE program, there have been 70 projects that are identified to improve traffic in the Chicago region. Of that quick snapshot, 28 are complete, 6 are under construction, 17 are in various design phases, and there are 19 projects that are still remaining to start design. A key project to eliminate conflicts and delays was the Inglewood Flyover. It's Project P1. The Inglewood Flyover was a $126 million federal grant with a $6.6 million state match. And it eliminated conflicts and significant delays at the Inglewood interlocking between 78 daily Metro commuter trains, 14 daily Amtrak trains between Chicago and points east, and 46 daily Norfolk Southern trains. The basic construction of the project featured the construction of bridge grade separation, taking the Metro Rock Island service over the Norfolk Southern tracks. And it's through the Norfolk Southern tracks that include the Amtrak corridor to the east. Another benefit of P1, which I'd be remiss not to mention, is that it also has reduced engine idling, and that reduces emissions and has improved air quality in the area. This project allows for future passenger growth along the NS corridor to points to the east, and also for Metro and passenger services. The P1 Inglewood Flyover was completed in May 2016, and we're happy to enjoy the benefits of this completed project. With that, thank you, and I'll hand it back to Randy Wade to introduce the next presenter. Thank you.
Thanks, Elliot. The Chicago terminal area clearly has it all. You've got 6 Class 1s, Metro and South Shore commuter rail, and Amtrak, so it's a great case study in terms of the last mile issues that are faced throughout the country. Our next speaker is John Schneiderbeck from Oregon DOT. He's going to be talking about the Eugene Layover Track projects and the Portland Union Station project. So take it away, John.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss a few of the items that Oregon DOT is working on as they relate to the Cascades corridor in the Pacific Northwest. So if you basically, just a quick background, the Pacific Northwest Rail Corridor stretches from Eugene, Oregon up to Vancouver, British Columbia, so about 425 miles, with 125 miles of that being in Oregon. Portland to Seattle has the most volumes, and we're going to be adding an additional 2 round trips in October, bringing 6 round trips plus the Coast Starlight and Empire Builder. So things can get a little congested there, but most of the activity, as you can imagine, would be between the Seattle area and Portland. So Eugene, Oregon is the southern terminus, and that kind of leads into the one of the areas where we're going to talk about right now. If you could change the slide. Basically, the project in Eugene addresses a major issue that we have, in a sense that the beginning and end of the daily round trip out of Eugene, the trains are stored in the Eugene Yard, which is about a 2-mile non-revenue movement from the station area to the Eugene Yard, which is owned by Union Pacific Railroad. Overnight maintenance, cleaning, etc. is done at that location, and then the train brought back in the morning for the first departure north. Some of the issues that we experience, and from conductor reports, there's a significant amount of delay annually to the on-time departure, that trains are either blocked in or movements can't be made at a certain time. So what basically we're looking at is how we can, basically keep the train at the station overnight and do the required maintenance, and how we can make less of a conflict with freight railroad. So next slide. So as I mentioned, the Eugene Yard, the delay issues, having that non-revenue movement. So basically, we see basically the solution is, laying over the Cascades train at the station. We have to meet the UP design standards with a lot of the work we're doing. It's a narrow corridor with buildings right up against the right-of-way and numerous road crossings which have to basically be accommodated or seek closures for different roads with the city of Eugene. Next slide, please. This is very difficult to see, but what this plan set shows right now is as you approach the station area from the south. Currently, the Cascades trains stop at the platform, which is also the yard lead to the Eugene station. So basically, when passengers board or unboard and then the train heads back north, there's a crossover just to the railroad north of the station. The trains hit the main line and then head north. There is no way right now for freight trains coming from the south, if the tracks are occupied by the Coast Starlight or the Amtrak Cascades trains, for those trains to bypass the station, cross over and get into the Eugene Yard. So next slide, please. As you see, the first conflict that we have in trying to fit a stub track in there would be Lincoln Street. So we've negotiated with the city of Eugene to close Lincoln Street, which also helps them in their quest to have a quiet zone through downtown. We would be looking at placing a platform and a stub track between the station and what you're seeing right now is Lincoln Street. The platform would be a 15-inch high platform meeting ADA standards, while being able to keep the about 750 feet for the Amtrak Cascades trains to sit at the station overnight and be maintained at that location. By adding a crossover to the railroad north, which we'll see on the next slide, basically that will allow freight traffic to stay on the main line, bypass the station area, and then even if there is let's say the Coast Starlight is late and the stub track is occupied by a Cascade train, it would allow northbound freight movements to bypass the station area and then use the crossover to the railroad north to access the Eugene Yard, eliminating any conflict between the Union Pacific and the short line railroads at this area. So next slide, please. The last slide here kind of shows some of the issues we're dealing with, in a sense of with the UP standards, because we have the crossover to the right of the plan set there, which allows the Amtrak trains leaving the station to enter the main line, but then we need a crossover placed between a few of the roads that we cannot close. So basically it shortens the distance between the crossovers. So this is one of the negotiating points that we're trying to figure out with Union Pacific. on how to implement this second crossover so they can utilize the main line and get over on that yard lead. There's no opportunity to close any more of the road crossings at this location, so basically shoehorning in as much as we can in these short little areas. This area is extremely unique in a sense that old historic structures come right up to the right-of-way line, eliminating our ability to widen track to meet current standards by Union Pacific, which requires 20 feet between track centers. Right now, the tracks are at 13 feet, and there's not much opportunity to widen things out. So it's just a lot of work that we're trying to do with Union Pacific to get this plan set to a point where we can begin finalizing the design and implementing the construction work. Next slide, please. In Portland, basically, this is one of the areas that we're beginning a long process on trying to figure out how we need to incorporate more capacity at the station to basically make the location accommodate Cascades trains north and south of the high shed, which is basically the crossing that you see on the picture on the left. The structure itself is going through some seismic upgrades. The high shed and canopies are well past their service life and are in dire need of replacement from seismic and even structural upgrades. At the station itself, we currently have 5 tracks that basically track 1 being closest to the station, which is normally used for storage and for routine maintenance. Tracks 2, 3, and 4 are mainly our Cascade service, loading and unloading. Track 5 is freight, as well as temporarily on track 4 as needed. And the Coast Starlight does stop here coming up from California, and that train is 1,240 feet long, so track 5 is definitely a very needed track for the loading and unloading of such a long train at this location. And it's almost double the length of the current Cascades trains. So a lot of negotiating with the railroads on how we're going to basically make this work. One of the limiting factors on the yard itself is, if you look at the map on the right, there's a pinpoint where Portland Union Station is. And if you notice, just to the south along the river, there's a bridge crossing there where the railroad comes across. And it's extremely sharp curvature coming into and leaving that bridge site, which really limits our ability to expand or to do any realignments of the tracks to the south of the station. So next slide, please. So basically what we talked about, a little bit of the capacity issues, because we cannot fit where the current location of the high shed is. We cannot fit the Amtrak Cascades trains both north and south of that canopy. So we have to take a look at how can we increase the capacity of Portland Union Station. The Cascades trains lengths being approximately 750 feet. And a lot of the seismic challenges that we have in relocation of pedestrian crossings, design, this being a historic structure, basically the new high shed and canopies and how those fit in with SHPO requirements, as well as upgrading the track and platform upgrades, as well as we're looking at adding a potential track 6 to accommodate freight to move the majority of the freight onto track 5 and track 6, which opens up capacity on track 4. So next slide, please. Basically, this is an overview of the area that we're looking at. It's a little hard to see, but in the center of the train station is where the high shed is, that larger shed that covers the crossings out to the track platforms. We're looking at moving that to the north approximately 200 feet. So basically that comes back into the building and how we're going to rearrange the interior of the building to accommodate pedestrian access and baggage access and those types of things onto the track platforms. So if we were able to move the high shed to that location, it allows a Amtrak Cascades train to be on tracks 2, 3, 4, and 5, both, or I'm sorry, 2, 3, and 4, both north and south of the high shed. So it almost doubles the capacity of the station just by moving the pedestrian crossing and high shed. One thing I'd mentioned in the previous slide was adding track 6, which would then allow a secondary main line through the entire area down to the railroad, up to the railroad north, basically to the area of BNSF Lake Yard. So allowing us more use of track 4 and still keeping freight capacity at or above its current level. So next slide, please. So some of the challenges we have, you know, basically currently we're going to have to upgrade the platforms between tracks 2 and 3, and those need to be brought up to 15-inch platforms. With a level crossing means trying to figure out how we can ramp, where trains have to stop, making that all work. So that's one challenge that we're working on with FRA right now, is how to make everything ADA compliant and still be able to accommodate the 3 different height sizes of the 2 different series of Amtrak Talgo trains, as well as the superliners that will stop on track 5. Here's just one example you can see on the picture of some things that we deal with. You have the Coast Starlight that stops on track 5 currently. Without that track 6, freight has to bypass on track 4 inside the station along platforms where there's active passengers, and that's one thing that we're looking at trying to avoid by adding track 6, which would allow this train not to have to access the station through track 4, but would be able to use track 6 on the outside and bypass the station completely. So between tracks 4 and 5, since those would currently be utilized by freight, we're looking at remaining at an 8-inch above top of rail platform, and that's been met with some resistance by both UP and the short line railroads that use this, and you know, they prefer the 8-inch platform. FRA is saying that it's a publicly owned facility, it needs to be 15. So we're in the process of trying to figure out what to do with that and how to make that work. So anyways, as I mentioned before, track 1 would remain a maintenance and layover track, since there's no way that we could accommodate a 15-inch high platform right off the station where it is. So that would remain an area where, you know, overnight service, refueling, etc. would be done. And then we're looking at the railroad north to add a stub track. So basically trains could be moved out of the station area and then moved back into track 1 for maintenance and shuffled overnight. So it leaves a lot of figuring how we're going to, you know, make that work by adding a stub track, and then obviously the negotiations on freight on use of track 4. You know, adding track 6, they see a benefit, but they don't want to lose the ability to be on track 4. So that's a negotiating piece that we're currently working through to make this work. Next slide, please. So anyways, that kind of concludes in a brief overview some of the items that we're working on as they relate to stations in Oregon. And basically, if you have questions, feel free to ask them, or feel free to get a hold of me through Randy at any time. So anyways, I'll give it back to Randy for the next step in the presentation.
Okay, before we introduce the next speakers, there's an opportunity to begin thinking about questions right now. Matt pointed out the chat box that's provided by WebEx for those participants in our virtual conference room. So begin entering your questions as our speakers move through their presentations, and then we can address them, you know, at the end. Okay, moving on to the Minnesota station experience, we're going to have Dan Crome and Frank Letterly talking about both an historic station being redeveloped and a wholly new station being developed, one in St. Paul and the other in Minneapolis. Dan, you want to kick it off?
Okay, thank you, Randy. And first of all, I'd like to thank AASHTO and Shane for the opportunity to share information on the 2 Twin City stations. I'll talk about the reestablishment of historic St. Paul Union Depot as an intermodal hub. And Frank will talk about the new multimodal station at Target Field in downtown Minneapolis. Next slide. Just a little bit of a history. As with all old stations, their lives have ebbed and flowed with the times. Advances in transportation and technologies impact that, and changing urban environment. Lower Town, where this depot has been an area for decades that's been struggling to find its identity, and has seen a major resurgence since the depot renovation, and other transportation aspects have been improved, including light rail. A brief review of the timelines. The depot was built between 1881 and 1913 at a consortium of 9 railroads. 1917 and 23, the construction of the head house, concourse, and waiting rooms were completed. When done, there were elevated train tracks, 10 platforms, and 21 tracks. At its height, there was over 240 trains a day that came left out of the depot. Many of those were soldiers, enlistees, getting to and from the upper Midwest to where they were in the service. And then, as with everywhere, passenger rail service diminished in the 50s and 60s. And the last train, passenger train, went to the depot in 1971. Ironically, the day before Amtrak began its service was the last day passenger train was at this depot. Amtrak built a depot halfway between Minneapolis and St. Paul. So the depot hadn't been used for passenger trains since '71. Continuing on, the next slide. The depot, as was identified as a historic National Register of Historic Places in 1974. From '71 to 2005, the concourse was empty, and the Postal Service, which had an adjacent mail sorting facility, bought the facility and was using it for basically truck parking, storage, and the concourse itself was inhabited by pigeons, as a lot of these old structures do. The benefit was it wasn't just taken down. The County Regional Railroad Authority established the buildings and platforms as a 33-acre parcel that's on the map. The depot itself is the white square with towards the left with a long white segment headed down to the bottom of the picture. The property goes all the way down to the Y area, and then the platforms are parallel to the river. The county created a locate task force to look at recommendations for a transportation hub. The Regional Railroad Authority, as I mentioned, established a 33-acre Union Depot property and purchased it back. The head house itself was sold to a developer, and he had put in, I believe, 30 condos. There were some retail businesses in there as well, but it was still fairly vacant and way underutilized. Minnesota, we have a authority, regional railroad authorities they're called. They're basically the county commissioners. They put on a different hat, but the advantage is they have a tax levying authority separate from their county taxes. In the metro area, they're really used for transit-type purposes. In the urban area, I mean. In the rural areas, they're really used to help support shippers and receivers for short line services. And it's been a really effective local tool to supplement state funds and initiate projects such as this on their own. And the goal was to achieve a brand new 1924. You have this jewel in the middle of your city. You have a growing transportation, rail transportation system, and that really provided an opportunity, and the county stepped up and pulled us together. Next slide, please. Multiple funding partners participated. There's a list of the different funding sources. All those funding sources had their own requirements related to timing, record keeping, and reporting. It was a quilt of funding to make the project happen. Total cost $243 million. Next slide. Some of the challenges and lessons learned. With multiple agency, coordination issues are beyond just budgets. who has authority, who can do what. We all are familiar with what that might entail. Timelines for use of funds needed to be woven together as well. We had constraints on the Tiger funds. Some of the state funds had sunset dates on them. So the time of this was extremely aggressive, which presented its own problems. One, finding skilled laborers in renovation was difficult to meet the time frames. The historic status of the building, the plus and a drawback as well. It provided its own challenge, appropriate treatments of materials. The mustard-colored ceiling here was the appropriate color at the time, and during the renovation, being in there, seeing these guys on their back, swabbing the soot and dirt off there to get back to the original cover and then repair where needed was a very laborious process. ADA accessibility and extensive historical research was necessary to move the project forward. And then, as I'd mentioned, finding skilled labor was a challenge. The facility, the parking deck, the structure itself was deteriorating to the point where it basically had to be rebuilt. Concrete supplies were low during the construction. Above the eastern part of the property, MnDOT was replacing a major north-south highway above where all the rail construction was going on. And retail space and tenants needed to be able to maintain their access to the facility as well. Next slide, please. Other challenges and lessons, signal work. Nothing is easy or as simple as planned. The original plan to have the depot area remain dark area, and the FRA, after the project was initiated, insisted that signal plans needed to be developed. Dispatching had to be coordinated between the three Class 1s that operate through the area daily. One railroad dispatches in, one railroad dispatches out. And then multiple stakeholders needed constant coordination, again, working with three Class 1s as well, the FRA, the Ramsey County Railroad Authority, and the state MnDOT. Weather particularly cold that year, more than normal, long cold freeze cycles, which is hard on workers and materials. And just to the west in that slide you saw, I referenced the Y. 5% of the nation's rail traffic travels through there on a daily basis, and that service had to be maintained and not impeded by this work. But with strong relationships and leadership by the Ramsey County Railroad Authority, depot was completed within budget, and in addition to the current Empire Builder train, the only train Minnesota has coming through that only services this station at this time, there's 3 intercity bus operators, Metro Transit local and express buses, the green LRT line that connects Minneapolis to St. Paul, and rental car facilities, bike shop, and storage on site. And as I mentioned earlier, the neighborhood area of Lowertown has had a parallel renaissance with the depot. I can remember 6-7 years ago, before the project was completed, the for lease vacant for development signs on all the buildings. You don't see one within 5 blocks of the depot now. And it's a vibrant, highly desirable commercial and residential area of St. Paul, and many of those attributes, many of the people attribute that to the rebirth of Union Depot. So I have a lot more to talk about, but I want to make sure Frank talks about the other projects sometime. If you want a lot more detail, we'd be glad to coordinate with Ramsey County to do that. So with that, here's Frank Lutterly.
All right. So in many respects, what we're looking at here is a sort of a tale of two cities, because we've got St. Paul as a very good example of how to rescue a historic structure and repurpose it back to its original purpose as a train station, and Minneapolis, which is building an entirely new station. A Target Field is the passenger rail station in downtown Minneapolis. It's known as Target Field Station because it's adjacent to the Minnesota Twins ballpark, known as Target Field. Target Corporation is headquartered in Minneapolis, bought the naming rights for both the stadium and the train station. At the time the station was being considered, and we only had the one long-distance Amtrak train called the Empire Builder, which at the time was using a station midway between the two downtowns. It's now using the Union Depot in St. Paul. But in the 90s and in the early 2000s, the Met Council, which is the MPO for Minneapolis, St. Paul, in cooperation with both county and city governments, conducted several studies related to the establishment of commuter rail service in the region and the enhancement of intercity rail service. And as you all can appreciate, an essential requirement for establishing commuter rail and improving intercity rail is the identification and construction of a railroad station. And in downtown Minneapolis, the existing railroad stations were either demolished or made inaccessible because most of what was once an extensive network of railroad tracks in the downtown area is really dramatically diminished to the point where there really is only one track crossing through the downtown area. Go to the next slide. Again, a fundamental requirement for the operation of a passenger station is being adjacent to railroad tracks, and the only available option in downtown Minneapolis is adjacent to what's known as the BNSF Railway Wayzata subdivision, which crosses the Mississippi River northwest of downtown and skirts the western margin. In the air photo that's on the screen, you can see the black line, which represents the existing BNSF railway, and then the blue dashed line, it represents the area that is occupied by Target Field. As late as 1990, this entire area of 2 blocks wide and several blocks long was once used as a railroad yard, was still vacant. In 1990, Interstate 394 was constructed and extended into downtown on one half of this property, and you can see the freeway marked 394. We also built 3 parking garages, which are imaginatively known as Garage A, B, and C. And in the air photo, you can see parking ramp B, which is at the lower part of the picture in the middle, next to the stadium, and ramp C is a little bit farther to the right. The remaining land was continued to be used for surface parking, and planning for both light rail transit and commuter rail identified the site in the late 90s, long before a new stadium was proposed. The site, of course, is constrained by many factors, including the stadium, the overhead, freeway ramps, adjacent development, and the Cedar Lake Bike Trail. On the other hand, this particular site is highly accessible from both city streets. The regional highway system has ample parking with the 3 ABC garages and excellent connections to both LRT and city buses. The next slide. So construction of North Star commuter rail, the extension of Hiawatha LRT, now known as the Blue Line, and the construction of the stadium occurred simultaneously. Target Field Station opened in November 2009. It's considered to be a combination intercity rail and light rail station. The BNSF freight track through this area is grade separated and lower than the surrounding properties. The North Star platform is at track level. The station tracks are connected to but independent of the freight main. LRT serves platforms at the street level above. LRT tracks and the platforms cross the railroad tracks and parallel freeway over the 5th Street Bridge, which was modified to accommodate the LRT tracks. Vertical circulation between the two levels is incorporated into the stadium structure. There is no formal station building in the traditional sense. There are only shelters on the platform for commuter rail and shelters for the platforms for LRT. And MnDOT participated financially in the construction of the vertical circulation and additional parking. The overall project was primarily funded through the FTA New Starts program. Since the construction of the station, a second light rail line known as the Green Line opened in 2014 and terminates at Target Field. A second LRT platform has been added to facilitate management of crowds exiting the ballpark following Twins games. Future extensions from Target Field of both the Blue Line and the Green Line are planned. Target Field Station is essentially the 0.0 milepost for all 4 lines in both directions. Currently, there is one platform at track level that is 420 feet long and 40 feet wide with 2 station tracks, one on each side. The station tracks extend to the west under the stadium, but both are stub end. Before the stadium was proposed, the full build-out of the station was planned to be much more extensive with a combination of through and stub end tracks and an overhead concourse. A lot of the planning for Target Field became very complicated when other advocates for the baseball stadium decided that this was really the best place for the stadium. And so there's a lot of planning went into trying to maintain the opportunity to use this site as a train station while building the stadium over it. So ultimately, the full build-out of the station, which is shown in this diagram, had to be significantly modified when the station was put in place. And the requirements for a full build-out are based upon extensive modeling that was done using RTC and incorporating all of the various commuter rail proposals and intercity rail proposals. And it's felt that the configuration that is shown here would accommodate all of that. The existing platform is located where the dark brown rectangular shape is between the 5th Street Bridge and the overhead I-94 ramp. The existing platform is actually wider than what is shown today. The red tracks are the existing tracks, and you can see that the existing platform is wider between the 2 existing tracks. But in the future, the existing platform would be narrowed and extended 400 feet. An additional platform would be added, the blue one, and 2 additional station tracks would be added. So ultimately, there would be 2 platforms and 4 tracks with a single connection to the freight main. Another complication of the site is the green line on the bottom, which is the Cedar Lake Trail, a bike trail. The challenge here is twofold. One of them is to preserve the sufficient space for even this modest build-out. It's been a particular challenge, particularly because developers have been active in the area. There are 2 developments that are outlined in blue to the right of the screen there. And when the first development came in, what's known as the Dock Street Apartments, it was determined that that development was going to impinge upon the proposed build-out, and so MnDOT had to negotiate with the city and the developer to purchase additional easements and shift the proposed building farther away from the tracks. The second development, which has been completed, the Hines development, required further discussions with the developer because we needed to ensure that, one, the building was placed far enough away to allow the station to be completed, but also to allow the ultimate construction of a crash wall along the margin and sufficient room to relocate the Cedar Lake Trail. And we actually designed an arcade in the building that ultimately will be where the trail will go. The trail will actually go inside the building once we do the full build out of the station. So a very constrained site, lots of imagination going into try to figure out how to build a station that is of sufficient size and also to continue to preserve the opportunity to do that work. Now, next slide. One of the things that we're working on right now is what's known as the Northern Lights Express, and that's relevant to the planning for Target Field because that would be the terminal station for a passenger rail service that would operate between Minneapolis and Duluth. The proposal is for operating at speeds up to 90 miles per hour with an average speed of 60 miles per hour for the 152 miles between the two terminals. Next slide. Planning for excuse me. Planning for NLX is very advanced. As of 2 weeks ago, we completed the Tier 2 project level EA. We completed significant amount of preliminary engineering, service development plan, financial planning, etc., all of which has been delivered to the FRA, and we would expect to receive a FONSI by the end of September. So if we go to the next slide, what's important, what's that? I'm not sure what you're showing. Oh, okay. What's significant here is that there's a plan for intermediate partial build out of Target Field Station in which we would add, we would extend the platform, put the NLX trains on one side of the platform, and put the North Star trains on the other side. So in addition to having the full build out plan, we have an intermediate build out plan. So future considerations are continuing to preserve the space for the full build out, improving accessibility for drop-offs and pickups, devising a plan for some sort of enclosed concourse, cooperating with adjacent developers for direct skyway access, and continuing to work with BNSF to support coordination of freight and passenger operations. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Frank and Dan. Our next speaker is Paul Worley. Paul's going to be speaking to some of the creative things that are being done in North Carolina to get people to the station as well as station development. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you. I trust you can hear me?
We can.
Okay, thanks, Randy. I'll tell you a little bit about what North Carolina DOT did with its trains. One of the issues was that while the stations throughout the corridor, with the exception of Raleigh and Charlotte, which are under construction, Raleigh being under construction and Charlotte being under planning now, in addition to the stations, being able to have better connectivity to the trains was seen as an opportunity for the Piedmont service, especially as the service looks to expand to 4 trains, 4 round trips in 2018. So the department pursued a partnership with the existing local transit systems that are on the route, and were able to come up with a common pass, a common ability to use a magnetic bar transit pass and have a common charge number on that, and coordinate that so that the conductors could provide that to riders to get the last mile ride, and that gave them a transit ride as well as a connector. So throughout the corridor, it is generally bus service, with the exception of Charlotte, where they do have the light rail. And so this was rolled out in March. It's grown steadily. The department is particular on handing those out as they are basically a form of currency, basically, for that service. The transit pass, after it is used, it is identified by the transit provider, and the department is then charged for those rides. And so, again, that's throughout the quarter and at no more cost to passengers. Next slide, please. Again, this gives you a little bit of an idea as to the tracking of this pass. It was promoted throughout our communities through press releases. Not a heavy marketing push, but cards in the seat pockets on the train. On our NCByTrain.org website, as well as transit partner websites, Facebook, and local media. So we figured it would be very much along the lines of riders discovering it and then using it when they came back. And so I think that is certainly the reason you see that increase, and we're going to continue to see that grow. This is going to be especially a good service in the Charlotte area, where our current station is north of the downtown, and we do not have great connections to what they call Uptown Charlotte, and this connection pass should help that our riders being able to reach that. I'll note that our marketing team at NCDOT, Alan Paul, who manages he's the acting director now, and now manages the passenger service. John Dees and Allison Boswell were very much involved in coordinating this, as well as some others on our team. Next slide. We have had some discussions, the department's had discussions with Uber after, it's hard for me to not say we after 29 years, but I'll just say it. We had meetings with Uber to look at what are some potential opportunities to expand and have options to the transit pass. There may be individuals who want to ride in smaller cars rather than mass transit. So we have discussed that. That's still under discussion between the North Carolina team and Uber, looking at partnerships to advertise and promote the service, looking at in-station signage, and then perhaps even special codes for first-time users as well. Whatever we do for Uber, as a public agency, the department will need to look at other service providers as well, and give those equal options, because our point is to expand those opportunities for last mile and not be exclusive. Next slide. We have had a long-standing effort on NC by Train, which is the brand for the North Carolina service, to have bikes on board. And there you see in the picture the new baggage car that's on the Amtrak trains, the Carolinian equipment, but also on the Piedmont equipment. We have bike racks in the baggage cars, have the 6 spaces available, and then also we can transport bikes if the racks are full as well in checked baggage. Pretty good ridership numbers as far as bikes, 1,200 passengers in the last 12 months bringing their bikes on board, and that's something that we continue to encourage both on our websites and marketing materials, as well as the very tight-knit bike community there too. Next slide. This is an innovative thing that Tim McHugh, who works as one of our marketing agents or customer service agents in the department, and coming up with bike lids. So if you have a nice bike and you want to store it at the station and not take it with you, and have it there when you get back. These bike lids were found. They were installed in 2016, and they give yet another option for people who may not want to bring the bike on board. They just want to take it to the station, but they want to lock it up and it be secure. I thought it was pretty neat the way they came up with Tim and the team that does this actually came up with markings, making them look like little locomotives there too, so helping to get the brand out too. There's still a lot of opportunities with bikes and rental bikes and such that we'll continue to be taking a look at too. Next slide. As we finish up this station, have a new station that's underway that will be open in the first quarter of 2018 in Raleigh, the Raleigh Union Station. That is being looked at for rental bikes. We currently have no plans for services at other stations, but this continues to be a growing industry. There are entrepreneurs that are certainly marketing and promoting their rental bikes, and we continue to hear from those. One of the pluses that we have with the corridor is we have so many colleges and universities along the line too. So the opportunity for that in the future, that will enable us to grow that and have the synergy with the universities. Next slide. I mentioned the Raleigh Union Station, and this is really a magnificent structure that is moving ahead with the department as well as the City of Raleigh on this. The City of Raleigh being the main grantee. The NCDOT has funding in the project as well as in both the track and the facility itself. It will open in February 28. And why this is important, we see for last mile, is that this will accommodate passenger rail and commuter rail in the future, but also buses, taxis, and bicycles. So having the ability to have a Union Station where you've got more area for passenger waiting areas, that you have this accessibility onto the train with center island platforms, with high-level platforms there, and being able to accommodate the future demand, that is really making the portal more efficient into the service. Next slide. And I don't know if you see this, but I see like a gray area over the slide. There it is. Again, this is another view of the Raleigh Union Station, and what you'll see here in the middle of the area there, you see looks like a trench that's concrete reinforced. That is the tunnel that comes from the concourse that would connect to the platforms, the center island platforms that are being built as part of that facility, and that is from last month. So that project is coming along, and I believe that there's very much excitement out there to see that open and how that's going to drive the service. It's always been very important to drive the two endpoints on the service. Next slide. The other endpoint, and we often call them the bookends on the Raleigh-Charlotte corridor, is the Charlotte Gateway Station. And the existing station, which is on North Tryon Street, opened in 1962. And so that has become outdated. It's certainly not what we want to have in the largest city in North Carolina, as well as the connectivity to uptown Charlotte, which has really enjoyed quite a bit of growth over the last 25 to 30 years. As part of that growth, we realized that the folks at NCDOT, names like Pat Simmons and Alan Paul and David King realized that there needed to be an uptown station. So in the early 1990s, NCDOT began acquiring some essential properties to accommodate the future station as far as tracks. And right now, the department owns 9 blocks of property that's assembled, including 1 parcel by the city, and there is a partnership there with the city that's underway to plan the station. But at the same time, funding has been received from grants to begin the platforms and the track work for that station as well. This Charlotte station, despite what it is, it's the second busiest in the Southeast, with over 200,000 passengers a year and 8 trains, the North Carolina service, as well as the national system train, the Crescent. So we're very limited there. Boarding on the mainline track, that does not make the host railroad, which is Norfolk Southern, happy at all. So the effort is on to move that uptown. And again, part of your last mile connections are having that efficiency of being able to go from very easily from the station to a choice of last mile services. Next slide. So one of the things that is underway in Charlotte is a station area plan, which is being done with some funding that was received from the Federal Railroad Administration, some planning money through a Tiger grant 3 years back. And so, looking at how the station works with the uptown is important and is being planned. But actually underway now is the track and the structures. It is a challenging location because the mainline tracks are grade separated from a number of the city streets. And so the plan involves establishing where the railroad infrastructure will go and how that will connect to the area which will one day be the station. It includes 4 new structures, 2 2,000-foot-long station tracks, a boarding platform, and a canopy. And this is seen as something that the host railroad, Norfolk Southern, is interested in as well, because we're separating the passenger trains from the freight operations in a very critical area for Norfolk Southern, as they have a regional intermodal facility near Charlotte, Douglas International Airport. The engineering plan is underway. The designers there at North Carolina DOT have worked very closely with Norfolk Southern on the modeling and what the needs are to provide connectivity there. And as you can see here, the LET construction contract is in February, with completing the construction in 2021. So this will be built adjacent to live track, and there will be a lot of coordination with Norfolk Southern. Next slide. So talking a little bit about the station itself, the reason the tracks were pursued first is looking at NET3 and the people that were that approached us, the entities that approached the state and the city when it came to development of the station, were concerned about how much of this is going to need to be taken up by the railroad and who's going to handle those negotiations, and all that's related to rail that generally people are not, developers are not used to dealing with. So in doing the track that you see that's visualized there in the image, you'll see building those station tracks establishes the footprint of what's needed for the railroad access, and enables the state, as well as a partnership from the city, to pursue a public-private partnership that leverages the ownership of the property. But at the same time, it is well known how much of that property can be utilized for that development. Whatever's left on this phase 1 is going to be utilized into this phase 2. The development market in Charlotte is robust, and there is a belief that it will support the completion of the permanent station as well as the related development. And so we'll be looking at that and looking at what is going to be very likely the best approach to take on this project. And the city is in the lead on the P3 procurement, considering the flexibility that they have when it comes to those kinds of arrangements versus state government. So that city begins to plan that, work on that procurement, and the station design team late this year. And that's Charlotte. Next slide. Why do we do this? Why is it important? More reliable rail service. As we look at this, and this is one of the graphs that often when I was director, went to the General Assembly and was asked about, your ridership is generally flat on your trains. And when you have, ultimately, it's going to be necessary, and the plan will be to extend the southeast corridor to connect to Richmond, Virginia. And then that would be a very robust multi-state regional service that would come from Washington, D.C. to Richmond to Raleigh to Charlotte. But in the meantime, lacking the track capacity that's needed for that larger project, we have this Piedmont service that runs between Raleigh and Charlotte, in addition to the Carolinian that goes to New York City. But you'll see that on the Piedmont service, the more frequencies you have, the more riders you get, of course, having that regularity and those flexible schedules. But also, as you look at doing RUS, which is the Raleigh Union Station, as well as the Charlotte Gateway Station, and then the improvements that are finishing up in North Carolina with the Piedmont Improvement Program, you'll see that really starts driving that ridership up, and you see how it starts to increase on those Piedmont trains that are Raleigh to Charlotte. So that is important when you look at going from around 440 to around 760,000 riders, and so that's vital. So that is the name of it. Is the game is to try to have more riders and to have more support for the service. Next slide. And that is it.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Great presentation. A lot of creative, I guess I would say, both marketing and service efforts in North Carolina. We've got time for some questions, a little bit left. The first question that came in the chat box was really from Shane, and also Sarah Rashid chimed in too. They were both interested in some of the grant opportunities that were available in various projects. I think Shane was in particular interested in the terminal area study that had been mentioned by Elliot. Elliot, you want to comment on your funding sources?
Sure. For that grant, in July 2014, FRA issued a Notice of Funding Availability, a NOFA, for passenger rail corridor investment plan projects, and that was part of fiscal year 14 omnibus funding. So that was the funding source for that project, the FRA funding. I guess to answer Sarah's question, I'm not aware of any funding opportunities right now. I know we're hoping that the FRA will issue a NOFA at some point, but we really don't know what their status is. I'd recommend checking the FRA website, and I'm sure it'll be published all over once it is issued.
Great. There's another question from Katie, and she's dealing with a situation where the local community has been willing to help maintain the existing station, but it looks like they need some motivation in terms of actually coming up with some additional capital to make physical improvements. Maybe Paul, from your Raleigh and Charlotte experience, how did you engage those communities and get their participation? What do you think was the motivator?
I think the motivator is the no-build alternative, which they see as unacceptable. We have been able to benefit in both locations by the Tiger Fund program, which is is not proposed to be funded in the coming year in one of the budget proposals, and we'll have to see how that goes. But those programs were critical towards providing a significant opportunity where the state and the cities had to step up and fund and be able to match in order to get the project moving. I think what we're going to see in talking about future funding, the infra program, the President administration has released information on. That program is going to be similar, with the exception of the entities will have to present projects that have commitments and that have funding, and that infra money is for something extra or some ability to finish something off. So it's where we kind of start with Tiger as being the first dollars. Maybe that wasn't what it was meant, but that's how it has worked in all practical purposes. Infra is looking to be the last dollars, and so it's going to be more important for locals to see that. In North Carolina, we also have a program, Strategic Transportation Investments, where all the modes are compete for funding that are the state money too, and passenger stations do, built right, improve freight operations too. So being able to look at improvements from both a safety and a capacity point of view is an opportunity there as well. But and you know, when you talk about local motivation, that is the difference between maybe a visionary station such as you've got in Raleigh and something that would be basic. When you start looking at transportation approaches, you can build basics and be able to fulfill the need. But in Raleigh, they wanted a meeting place. They wanted it to be seen as something that would be a catalyst for development, and we're already seeing it there in the city. And they made a good call on that and went on ahead with something that was very much a centerpiece of their downtown. So it's really helping as you look at the communities and you think about leveraging, it's more about leveraging the desires and their projections towards the future in their area, and how are they going to handle it, and what do they want to be, in addition to what must they do. So I hope that helps.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Those are good pieces of advice. I'll allow one more follow-on the topic of funding, which is a big one for everyone. Dan, I looked at the lineup you had in terms of funding sources for the St. Paul Union Depot. What do you think was critical in terms of that project? It was a $243 million project with, a number of funding sources.
Well, Randy, I think it was just the timing of a lot of it. The Safety Lou funds, the Tiger application was a substantial piece, commitment on the part of the FRA. And can't diminish the role that the Ramsey County Railroad Authority did in providing funds. They're the driver behind the project, coordinator of the project, and did all the pursuit for the funding. We ended up putting in $10 million of the $13 million in state bond funds from the appropriation, the bonds that we got for intercity passenger rail service. And frankly, out of the $26 million we got, we have 15.8 of it tied up in facilities where, one, we don't have service yet, but it's a matter of planning for the future. We aren't investing in these for today. We're investing for 50 years from now. So we're fortunate to be able to have that opportunity, and I think that was the critical part, was the locals driving, packaging it all together.
Thanks a lot. That's a good case study. I think we're coming close to our closing time. I want to throw it back to Shane in terms of next steps and any final comments.
Yeah. Hey, Randy, thanks, and I really appreciate all the states that participated in this, from presentations as well as those that are listening in on the webinar. If you have additional questions that you'd like to submit for the panelists or for others, please feel free to email me, sgill@ashto.org. and I will get those answered, and we'll include those in kind of the final wrap-up of the webinar. Again, this has been recorded, and that will be posted on our website, as well as the individual presentations and a list of the questions. And then Randy and his team, HNTV, is going to kind of give us a wrap-up of this webinar in a short little paper that they'll produce for us. And this was kind of solicited by the Resource Center members. We sent out a survey to the Resource Center members. This was the topic that bubbled to the top. There are others, and I know that Caitlin has put out a request for additional topics. So if anyone on the call, Resource Center member or not, would like to see a topic pursued for a similar type webinar, let us know, and we'll be glad to get it on the list.
Great. Thanks a lot for, I think, a successful webinar. Great experience for us, and I hope for everyone else. And I think with that, we will adjourn.
Thanks again, Randy.
Thank you, Randy.